Hi, folks. So you should be jumping into Module 1 now, and one of the topics that we think is sort of inherent in our course in macroeconomics is a little bit of microeconomics, and we realize that some of you might not have had this material, and for others of you, maybe you have had it, but you might be a little bit rusty. So we want to kind of dust off the rust and the must. Okay, this is meant to complement some of the readings. For example, in the one of the first chapter, I believe it is. It's of Greg Mankiw, and it's pages uh, 5 through 9. Alternatively, I've mentioned, I've been working on a textbook myself, and I'd be very interested in your feedback on it. I have posted chapter 3, but all you should really be facing is 16 through 23. Anyway, let's refresh our idea. Now, we can be applying the concept of supply and demand to any market. We're going to look at the oil market. It's a world market. We can talk about how many billion barrels per day, how many units might be produced in the oil market, and then the price per barrel. And the idea is that that agents have a diminishing, or the market participants have a diminishing marginal valuation. You can think about some of these some market participants that really have to have the oil, and they're up here. They're willing to pay a whole lot of money, and then as we walk down this demand curve, some people or firms are willing to pay less, perhaps because they have, let's say, closer substitutes. Since I ride my bicycle to work, I'm probably willing to pay much less. So my valuation on oil implicitly is much lower. But anyway, that is a demand curve, and we could apply that also to flat screen TVs. We could think about, well, okay, if flat screen TVs were very, very expensive, we would see a lower demand. But if we were if flat screen TVs fell in price, people would likely buy more. So if they were very, very cheap, as is happening now, you might have two in your house rather than one. So now the next thing is how we want to turn to the supply, and the idea here is that in general, a supply curve represents, this is, once again, this is the quantity on the horizontal axis, and this is the price per barrel. Once again, we're referring to the oil market, but this could be the market for any good or service. And the idea is that that as the price paid to the supplier increases, more suppliers will come in, they will provide more. That's why this is an upward sloping supply curve. Now, there are other ways we can think about this. Referring to specifically to the oil market, you can think about some very cheap fields and then some very much more expensive fields. And you can think that when we think about the opportunity cost, what you could be earning elsewhere, that rises when we compare different when we sort of line up the suppliers from the cheapest to the most expensive. So the idea is, once again, as the price offered to the supplier rises, more and more oil fields will come into it will come into production. Each oil field may even be producing more. It may be working overtime. They may have to pay their workers more. Rising opportunity costs. Okay, so that's the idea behind an upward sloping supply curve. Now, when we put them together, okay, the idea is that there is a market equilibrium, a price at which the supply equal demand. And in order to know that, suppose that we were in a situation down here. Suppose that we started off with a price that was less than the equilibrium price, this equilibrium price where the intersection was. Okay, so if we had a price that was less than equilibrium price, then this would be what we call a situation of excess demand. That on the one hand, demanders seeing all this, seeing their in this case oil being offered at a very, very low price, they'll be falling all over themselves. At the same time, the willingness of suppliers to bring their oil to market is going to be low. So this is what we call an area excess demand, where let's say the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. So what's going to happen is, on the one hand, demanders will compete with one another, and in so doing they'll be bidding up the prices, and at the same time that's going to be drawing more and more producers into the market. They're going to be supplying more, and ultimately we will arrive at this equilibrium point here where supply is equal to demand. Now let's kind of hone our intuition from the other end. Let's suppose that the price is up here. Here we're kind of choking off demand, and at the same time you have suppliers at this initial very, very high price. They're sort of glutting the market. So when you have this glut of market, we call that a situation of excess supply. What happens is that in some cases suppliers will be sort of dumping their stuff and reducing their prices, and at the same time, as suppliers see that their yield or the price that they receive in the market isn't as much as they thought it was going to be, some of them will pull back on production. Maybe if we're talking about oil fields, we're talking about fewer and fewer oil fields. Some oil fields may be taken out of production. We've actually seen that in the United States recently, when we talk about the shale oil fields in the upper Midwest. And at the same time, as prices come down, more and more buyers will be drawn into the market. They'll be enticed to buy more and more and more. Why is that? Because the price is falling, and ultimately we will ultimately get to this point where one price equates supply and demand. And that is the basics of supply and demand. One of the most basic things that you need to know.